Right, well, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
This morning's topic concerns the English vowel system. In my view, a very important factor about the English vowel system is that we have not one vowel system, but two. Because English is one of those languages in which we have important processes of vowel weakening, also known as vowel reduction. Now, among the languages of the world, some do and some don't. Of those that do, in some languages, Russian for example, it's extremely predictable. Once you know where the stress is, you know automatically the effects upon vowels that are unstressed. The English vowels are particularly complicated because we have weakening processes for which the rules are difficult, sometimes quite incoherent, and certainly not thoroughly regular. Nevertheless, we can detect important differences between strong vowels and weak vowels, as we see immediately if we compare various sets of related words. Consider on the handout, first of all, related words such as anatomic and anatomy. Now, if we wanted to simplify English, we would make everybody pronounce these words anatomic, anatomy. But that's foreign to English. In real English, if you listen carefully to the vowel qualities, we have anatomic, anatomy. In other words, the stressed vowels have a strong quality, o, anatomic, and the unstressed vowels typically have an schwa quality, anatomy. And notice how the first three vowels in those two related words vary according to the stress. The stress, of course, follows its own rules. The suffix "ik" has the effect typically of causing the stress to fall immediately before it, and then various other stress rules cause the secondary stress on the first syllable. So we have some degree of stress on an and tom, but not on the anatomic. We have stress on the in anatomy, and no stress on the so that weakens. Similarly, in hundreds of other pairs of words, democratic, compare democracy. Here's some more examples. We say to repeat. To repeat, notice the prefix spelled re is rip. Some people say r, but it's a weak vowel, repeat or repeat. But then when we have the ischen suffix, that attracts the stress, and so we get repetition. Because of the general rule in English that you can't have two thoroughly unstressed syllables at the beginning of a word, you've got to have secondary stress on the first syllable. Therefore it gets the vowel e, repetition. So typical foreigners' errors are, on the one hand, repetition, over-weakening. On the second hand, repeat or something, doing the wrong things in the first one. It's repeat, repetition. Notice the same effects in to record, the verb, typical verb stressed on the end, disyllabic verb, of a noun, a record, stressed on the first, typical disyllabic noun. Record, record, verb and noun. Now this shows the complications. Most British people say for the noun a record, where, strangely enough, we don't get weakening of the second vowel. We still say or in that unstressed syllable, a record. Some people do say a record, and particularly Americans tend to say a record, so that's perhaps more regular. But this is why life is quite complicated, because you can't altogether predict these things from the morphological facts. Down at the bottom, notice the example, phonetics, phonetician. Phonetics, there the "ik" suffix has the effect of throwing the stress onto the net, phonetics. The first syllable, now people say to me sometimes, don't you say phonetics with a strong vowel? Some people do, those who don't know anything about the subject, if it's an unfamiliar word to them. But there's a general tendency in words that are familiar to weaken unstressed vowels more readily. So people who talk about phonetics all the day weaken that and say th in the first syllable of phonetics. On the other hand, in phonetition, stress on the tish, we've got therefore to have secondary stress on the tho, and that keeps it strong phonetition. What we notice here is also the effect of various affixes, affixes that cause the stress to fall in a particular place. That's a topic for a different lecture, but notice how affixes can cause the stress to go elsewhere. Okay, and so we've got the verb to preside and the noun president. Notice the effect just as with repetition, so we alternate between weak in preside, again some people say preside, but it's got to be strong when it's stressed because of the effect of the ENT suffix in president. When I look back at the handout, you will see other phenomena to do with weakening. There are a number of words where we have both a strong and a weak pronunciation, and both are in general use. For example, the names of the days of the week. You can say Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or you can say Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And that is a difference in whether or not you weaken the day part of it. There's a general tendency to keep it strong when you're emphasizing it, when it's at the end of an utterance. I'll do it on Monday. And a general tendency to weaken it when it's part of some greater structure, so on Monday morning, Tuesday evening, Wednesday afternoon. But that's not set in iron. You can, in general, use either pronunciation in any circumstance. So that's good news, really, for the foreign learner. Certain months equally show variable weakening in the first syllable. We can say November, or we can say November. We can say September with sep, or we can say September, weakening it to sip or sip. And that's typical of quite a large number of words in the vocabulary that you have a choice about whether you weaken them or not. There are some more examples. 3 related words: vary, variation, variety. Well, vary has air. When we add the suffix ation that attracts the stress to itself, we get secondary stress on the air, so it remains with the quality of air, variation. But when we add the ety for the abstract noun, that has a different stress effect, society and so on. It causes the stress to fall on the last syllable of the stem, making it strong I instead of weak I, and therefore air weakens to and we get variety. So if you study sets of words of this type, you could perhaps get a feel for the alternations that typically occur. They're not shown in spelling. With very few exceptions, they're not shown in spelling, so they're quite difficult if you have a writing-based approach to English. But they're very clearly present in pronunciation. So we don't say variety, we say variety, we don't say vari, we say vary. The situation is made even more complicated by the fact that different accents of English weaken in somewhat different ways. And RP itself has clearly changed over the past century. If we take the word at the bottom, Daniel Jones pronounced it something like this: visibility. Visibility. With great visibility. I don't say visibility because I'm 100 years younger than Daniel Jones. I say visibility. Visibility. And do you notice the different weakened vowels? The stressed vowels are the same, but the weakened vowels are different. Visibility. Now, in fact, my final vowel is much the same as Jones's, but we'll look at that in just a moment, why we now write it in a different way, visibility. Then there's the question of function words, words with weak forms. I I think most of you will know about these. We have some 50 or so important grammatical words, function words, pronouns, auxiliary verbs, modals, prepositions, conjunctions, words of that kind, which have two pronunciations, a strong form, which is characterized by having a strong vowel, and a weak form, characterized by having a weak vowel. So we have a strong form, can. Tell me when you can. I'm not sure if I can. Weak form, can. I can do it tomorrow. They can do anything they want. Likewise, strong form, of, weak form, of. What's it made of? Strong form in exposed position. It's made of brass. A cup of tea, weak form, of. Again, strong vowel, of, weak vowel, in, of. Them, strong vowel. Strong form is them. I can see them, but I can't see the other ones. Weak form, them, with a weak vowel, the. Tell them what to do. So, I want to define the weak vowel system as being those vowels which can result from vowel weakening. We look at these various different processes of weakening and ask, what are the end results of weakening? The set of vowels that we get through weakening is the set of weak vowels. And we distinguish then this set of weak vowels, this weak vowel system, from the strong vowel system, which is all the ones that occur in the normal stressed syllables. What then are these weak vowels? Two on the handout. Well, it seems to me we clearly have to recognize fewer vowels than in the strong system, and perhaps it's best to regard it as consisting of 5 terms as set out here. So, first of all, we've got a vowel that we saw at the end of vary, compare variety. This is found at the ends of words like happy, coffee, valley, pretty, and before another vowel in words like radiate, the radiate. Now Daniel Jones equated this with it, and that reflected reasonably the pronunciation which he used, and indeed which I used. Happy, coffee, valley, pretty, radiate. It's not quite so clear in radiate. In fact, in rapid speech, it's often quite difficult to decide what the quality of this vowel is. Because it's unstressed, it's said fast, you can't always tell. But we also notice that in many other varieties of English, and increasingly also within RP, if you force people to say, now is this a vowel of bit, or is it a vowel of feet, make them choose one or the other, increasingly they're choosing beat. If I now, with my English undergraduates, put that test to them, force them to choose, to identify the vowel happy, either with that of bit or beat, I get something like 85% choosing beat. And that's a difference, because for people of my age it was perhaps 50-50, for Gibson's age it was 60-40, for Jones's it was perhaps 80-20. There's been a clear drift towards a tighter E quality here. Now, that's all very well, and it's interesting for us to investigate this, but for the many, many learners of English who have a problem distinguishing A and B, this is good news, because it means that in these weak positions, it doesn't matter. So if you've been struggling between ship and sheep, between grin and green, remember that where we write this weak vowel system, vowel, this term here, it doesn't matter which it is. Indeed, it's a false choice, because there's no possibility of distinguishing between words, that happy is one word and happy is another word. They're different ways of saying the same word. Radiation, radiation, couldn't be different words, they've got to be different varieties of the same word. Alright, so we've got this weak vowel E that ranges over the phonetic space of I and E. And you'll notice that works on English phonetics published in the last 10 years or so have started to use, generally adopted, this extra phonetic symbol, which may seem like a complication because we're adding an extra vowel to the system, you might think. But no, we're telling you that in the positions where this vowel occurs, the contrast between E and A doesn't operate. So this appeared first in the Longman Dictionary of Contemporary English, then I used it in my Longman Pronunciation Dictionary. It's now been adopted by Mr. Ashby in the latest version of the Oxford Advanced Learners Dictionary, for which he was responsible for the pronunciation. Roach, English Phonetics and Phonology, meanwhile, also adopted it. So there's a general consensus that this is what we ought to do. Well, if this corresponds to E in weak positions, so we have a corresponding back vowel that reflects a neutralization of the distinction between U and U. So this occurs in thank you. In fact, it's the typical weak form of U, strong form U, weak form U. You might equate this with of good, but it's not exactly the same because it can't be stressed, it's unstressed. You can't say I can see yo. No. When it's stressed, it goes to a strong form, which is U, I can see you. But we don't say thank you on the whole with strong U. We weaken it a bit. Thank you. Same thing before a vowel in situation. Situation. Notice also the difference between the adjective immune and the verb to immunize. Immunize. It's the weak one. But the most obvious weak vowel is the schwa, typical words like common, better, allow, where in the unstressed syllable we have In many varieties of English, including RP and most British English, we need to recognize a weak I, which we see, for example, in the plural ending, horses, weakened from repetition, repeat, in things like related and so on, delay, defer deference, refer reference. But we can also notice that other varieties of English, Australian English, American English, don't distinguish between this and schwa, and therefore say horses, Australian, related, and so on. So the difference between and the is perhaps not very important. No? There are plenty of words in my kind of English where the difference appears to be important, because we have valid, which doesn't rhyme with salad. In my kind of English, valid, salad, because I have two different weak vowels in the syllables. But there are regional varieties of English that say valid, salad, and certainly Australian English says valid, salad. Equally, there's a weak U in received pronunciation. We say things like stimulus, and that middle vowel is U, a bit like good, stimulus. Nevertheless, it has a casual variety, which is a schwa, stimulus, in less careful speech. And in American English, that would be the usual pronunciation, stimulus. Notice a word like what the Americans call educate. I think normally say educate, at least in more careful speech. But this is characterized by having j, not j, and having more educate. But things are changing. I certainly have a casual speech variant, which is educate. It's just a matter of what happens in the more careful style of the speech. And I think there's a change over time happening. Executive gradually giving way to executive. And indeed we have a vulgar variant which has no yaw and is executive. So the story about weak vowels is quite complicated. But nevertheless, some control over it is very important if your English is to sound native-like rather than foreign.